CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture.
Hello and welcome to CEU Medieval's radio special on the conference from Ctesiphon to Toledo, a comparative view on early church councils in East and West. We are joined by Professor Volker Menze, the organizer of this conference. Volker, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
The topic of this conference, as well as the title, sounds quite intriguing. Could you tell us what were your ideas behind it and why Ctesiphon and Toledo?
Well, the idea behind this was to get people together who work or who are interested in councils, because I think there's still a lot we can learn about late antique and also early medieval councils. Bringing together people from different disciplines. People working on the Merovingian councils usually do not work with people who work on ecumenical councils, or people working in the Syriac world are usually not in contact with people from the early medieval West. And looking at councils more broadly, I thought would help to get an idea what's there, what can be done. I'm obviously a historian, not a theologian, and I'm interested in, how procedures work, what are the reasons behind bringing together a council, both, if you think about the ecumenical, we're speaking about the emperor. If you think about the post-Roman West, we are speaking about kingdoms. Some of them also have, we call them then Arians. Armenian, I think, is probably more fitting, the Council of Rimini. So not even having, their patrons of these councils, but not even having the same belief as these Nicene bishops coming together for the council. And I thought it would be good if we get into conversations between different disciplines, different people interested in different kind of councils, if we find a common ground. Ctesiphon, Toledo, obviously to have kind of the geographic spread. Ctesiphon would be the most eastern, so kind of inviting those people who do Syriac sources, Syriac text. And Toledo, as we have a good number of councils in Toledo. Now don't ask me how many it exactly were, but a good number. And this is Visigothic Spain, so that's kind of the outmost west.
And bringing not only different disciplines, but also different periods and different regions into conversation, how can studying the councils in comparative perspective help us understand not only the councils themselves, but rather the culture and society of late antiquity in general?
Well, sometimes, we make assumptions. We have sometimes only one specific text, canon, for example, and we use them, canonical text or, legal text, which, is also something where I think very Roman, this is, Christianity, is something that particularly, if we speak about Ctesiphon, it's also beyond the border of the Roman Empire, but otherwise it comes out of the Roman Empire, and from very early onwards we find legal sources. And we sometimes assume then this is used for all Christians. Is it really? If you sometimes look then at Concilia Acts, you realize maybe this was not known. Maybe we today consider this something that must have, been written before this or that council, but it doesn't really. So, if this is the case, what are regional particularities? What is, something this we can say they all have in common, in terms of procedure. Also, can we bring together how minutes are being made? This is something we are at the moment very interested in, because we look at this, for example, Chalcedon. We know this Richard Price has done an awful lot on the Council of Chalcedon, also in Ephesus as well. And we have Thomas Kraumann also, who wrote a book on councils now, but this is particularly focused on Ephesus and Chalcedon, because we have so many acts there that we can also see, also with the translations into Latin, certain differences being visible there. So if we are there having comparison, can we say, this is how in general this has been done? There have been some previous work also done, I think here of Andreas Wegwart, who worked on the councils, particularly the Western councils. So, but I think there is still a lot that can be done, and historians probably should be more interested in councils. In the past, we have more theologians who actually have looked at the records.
You mentioned that historians should be more interested. I think that we can say that this is a very, not only optimistic, but very pioneer activity. So, from your own perspective, what do you think that the future will bring? And what are some of the possibilities in this field, and how do you plan to use these possibilities?
Well, one thing I think I would immediately say is, now not historians alone should take over to just, think about this is all about politics. I argue, I have written recently a book on Dioscorus, and I say, a patriarch of the 5th century, and I say this is very much about ecclesiastical politics. But I think it would be wrong to leave out theology. We should also not play one against the other and say, this is all. I mean, for the emperor, I do think it is about politics. I mean, if you try to hold together an empire, there are so many parties interested in, in one side or the other. You would like to stay in power. This is one of the very important things, and I'm very hesitant to see emperors as theological connoisseurs. That can, of course, also happen. I also think emperors have belief. But clearly, when we speak about the bishops, I'm very certain that, someone like Cyril, Dioscorus, Theodoret, they have theological persuasions. And we should not exclude them. So if we now have more more historians working on councils, we should always have in mind it's also about theology. We should not leave this out. So I think one promising avenue is, of course, if we have interdisciplinary meetings. Maybe, the conference from Ctesiphon to Toledo was very broad. Maybe it makes more sense to have, a certain systematic topic picked out of this, not just in general comparative, but certain aspects that we can make in a comparative perspective, or in less less broader. This was, I think, we said something 300 to 700 or so, chronologically a little closer together, but still have conversations between people from different disciplines. I think that would be something I imagine, and I hope something to do this also, to bring people again together, maybe to Vienna, also CEU, or maybe another place, to have regular conversations on councils in late antiquity, and also bring in here the early Middle Ages.
And for the very end, a question we asked every participant: what are your advices for young scholars and emerging scholars who are interested in studying church councils?
I think the most important answer is you need to have fun in what you do. That's very serious. I mean, it sounds like I'm making a joke here, but I think this is actually the number one. People coming into our field, I think they have already dedication. It's not that you do this because you think you have a well-paid job lined up when you are finished with what you're studying. But that also means you need to remain having fun and not feel at some point being burdened in what you're doing, or you're not. So you still remain, you always need to have this in focus, that this is something you really want to do. Make it then also interesting to you, also write it interesting for you, that you would like to read it, and you can imagine that others would also like to read this.
I am Claire Fauchon-Claudon. I'm coming from the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon. I am an assistant professor in classical antiquity, Roman antiquity.
Okay, thank you. And could you tell us, in your opinion, why is it important to study church councils? And how can studying church councils help us understand the culture and society of the late antique period?
Yes, I think that church councils were very important in a political and in a religious way. From my field of perspective and my area of expertise, I would say that they participated to the Christianization of society and urban and more generally the landscape of antiquity. And for example, we can see obviously some churches that emerge, but also some building structures to welcome travelers, and for me it's very important.
And then, regarding your topic,
yes,
could you tell us, where did all the bishops sleep? It seems like a big logistical entertainment. How did it work?
Yes, it's a difficult question to answer because the documentation is incomplete on that point. You have to cunningly read between lines. Well, for the bishops, there were several options. They are very important people at that time, like the most powerful of the time. So they would prefer classical xenia with friends, peer-to-peer hospitality, so notable domus or imperial palace or episcopal palace. And we can read sometime that they were disappointed by the welcome they received. The episcopal palace was too small for them, or the food was not good. And sometimes also they declined invitations because of conflicts and relations very hard. And it's the example of Theophilus of Alexandria in 403. He refused the invitations of John Chrysostomus, and he preferred the accommodation of the palace of Placidianum, that is one of the residences of the Empress Eudoxia. And perhaps it is because it was more comfortable, but it could be also because he wants to show his links with the imperial family.
And regarding traveling, do we have any sources that tell us how did they travel, where did they travel? You know, having entire Roman Empire come to one point is surely a big endeavor.
Yes. Historically, there is a big change because in the 4th century, for the first time, Constantine gave his authorization to use the cursus publicus, which is the imperial system transport. And so it shows the collusion between ecclesiastical and political power. It was in 314 for the Synods of Arles. And at that time, the roads were very good. And so for the cursus publicus, you have a lot of relays. You can eat, you can have new horses, you can rest, you can have a bath. There is some music, sometimes there is some prostitution. And so very early, the church was very worried that bishops or clerics on the road were mixed with these people. And so that explains the regulations taken in later councils about the use of xenodokeion, for example, that is structures for Christians without rank considerations, but moral considerations. And at the end, by Procopius, that under Justinian, the cursus publicus and the roads, were not so good. So he made new transformations that roads could be good enough again.
Well, a lot of what you said is based on textual sources. Are there any archaeological sources which could also help you attest to your research?
Yes, there are. But they are difficult to use. For example, when you want to identify a xenodokeion, it's not very easy because there is no big difference between a xenodokeion and a classical inn or relay of the cursus publicus. There is no difference in the planimetry, no difference in the infrastructure. So if you don't have an inscription that show you it is a xenodocaion or other things, you can be sure that they are. You have some good example. For example, in Merida, we have that type of collusion between archaeological and epigraphic sources. And on the other side of the empire, in the eastern part, we also discover that the term Pandocaian, which is not the common Christian word to design, to show a structure of Christian structures, they were very near a big sanctuary of Saint Simon. So you have to be very prudent, very careful.
And speaking of late antique councils in the widest possible chronological sense, when monasteries came to be an institution as themselves, did they play a part? Are there any sources which tell us about council participants sleeping or having any interaction with monasteries?
Yes, that's a good question, and the sources are very difficult to read in that point. Because we know, for example, in big cities like Constantinople, that there are huge monasteries and that monks participated during councils. There is a lot of stereotypes associated to monks who were a violent mob who help some bishop. It's like the Parabolani, also very different, but from Cyril of Alexandria. And the archaeological discovering in, for example, Palestine, Old Palestine, show us that in the desert of the Judean, there was some big monastery with a specialized area for strangers. So if you are a monk, you can enter and perhaps be accepted by the monks at the table of the monks. But if you are not a monk, like a cleric or something else, you have to be in that particular area.
For the very end, what would be some advices that you would give to young scholars and emerging scholars who are interested in the field of church council studies?
Well, to be passionate, to be creative, perhaps creative with the new digital tools that you can have and develop. And then, the good historian is not the one that gives answer. It's the one that asks good questions. So it's up to you.
Okay. So I am Mark DelCogliano. I'm professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I've worked there for almost 15 years. And I'm a graduate of Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I specialize in the study of early Christianity, and so more specifically, I studied the development of early Christian doctrine from the 3rd century to the 5th century or so. So I've mostly studied 4th and 5th century kind of Greek thought is my area. Basil of Caesarea, Athanasius, the kind of big names that way. Trinitarian doctrine, kind of Christological doctrine, all those sorts of things.
Can you tell us, in your opinion, why is it important to study church councils? And how did church councils affect culture and society of the late antique period?
So that's a big question. So why it's important, I think, is it is evidence that is untapped. So as was mentioned at the beginning of this conference, the Acts of the Councils were edited in the early 20th century. So it took 100 years or so, and these are massive volumes, all in ancient Greek or at times like in Latin as well. and these volumes are really hard to use because of the different collections and how they're organized. And the past 20 years or so largely through the works of Richard Price, these are now these have been translated into English, and so scholars have this wonderful material and a really good English translation with all these great introductions and annotations, and they could be studied from a variety of different angles. So as this conference is showing, so the one can study these materials from a whole bunch of different points of view. Now, so we have all this material, but this also raises the interest in other councils for whom the acts don't survive. So like the Council of Nicaea, for example, but there are no acts for that council, but it's a very important council. And there are other councils as well, and we wish that we had more information about what actually went on in them. So why are these councils important? These kind of set the parameters of the theological debate in the aftermath of those councils. So the Nicaea, for example, so that's the kind of paradigmatic example. So the debate over Nicaea, so that lasts at least 50 years, if not longer. The Council of Chalcedon. So Chalcedon happens in 451, but there's a long reception of that council, which lasts over 100 years as well. So they kind of set the parameters for the following debate. So I think at one level, the ordinary Christian is not that affected by these councils. So these are debates which are happening amongst the elites, right? So just like today, a Catholic cannot care about what's going on in Rome, and it could be a perfectly good Roman Catholic, but what's happening at the elite levels, he eventually does kind of filter down to the ordinary people, and so while the event of Nicaea had no immediate effect, on Christian life, 100 years later, it's really affecting how people actually worship in the churches, and all this stuff there. So it's a long story that way.
And regarding the topic of your presentation at this conference, could you tell us what are these double councils and how does one coordinate councils which are so far apart from each other?
Yeah, so a double council is a rare thing in the history of Christianity. And so essentially what it is for a number of reasons, it was chosen not to meet in a single place, but to meet in two different places and to have both the councils agree on the same thing somehow. And so the paper I gave was on a double council which happened at Ariminum in Italy and Seleucia in Thesauria, which is kind of southern Turkey. And they were both presented with the same creed, and it was hoped that the bishops at those two councils would agree to this creed, that they would kind of sign on to it. And then delegates from that council would meet with the emperor, and they would enact a kind of empire-wide unity. So as it turned out, both councils didn't agree to the same creed, and the delegations that actually went to the emperor were not in harmony. And so the double council, the model was a kind of a disaster. And so it's only through the efforts of Emperor Constantius that he managed to get everybody to, in the end, to agree. And it's interesting that no future emperor ever again attempted to do a double council because it involved too much coordination on the part of the imperial officials who were in charge of the councils and the bishops. I think there was simply too many unknown factors, things which could have gone wrong. So doing a single council was hard enough. Doing two councils at once was a really tall order. Yeah.
And regarding this, given also the fact that ecumenical councils, for example, had participants who were Greek speakers from the East and Latin speakers from the West, do you think that there was a linguistic barrier between the two, in your opinion?
Sure. So there were linguistic barriers, but in all the evidence that I know, speaking only Latin, or only Greek, was not a barrier, because there were always people around who were bilingual, and they were able to do either translation, like the documents. So I'm sure that those could have been done in advance. But there's also live translation as well. So there are some parts, like in the Acts, where it seems like they're doing a kind of live translation, so a Latin speaker is speaking in Latin, and that's being translated into Greek as they speak. So there were ways of getting around that. Now, in terms of in terms of the kind of conceptual idioms for the theological issues at big, that might be a different story, So the Greeks had their own terminology for speaking about things, and the Latins had their own terminology, and so that might have been a barrier. But in terms of just the general language, I don't think that was much of an issue.
And as a sum up, what would be your advice to emerging scholars and young scholars who are interested in the study of church councils?
So the thing I always tell graduate students and those who are interested in studying is to do your languages. Read as much Greek and Latin as you can. I would say even today, also venturing into the Eastern languages like kind of Syriac, like Coptic. The better you are at those languages, that gives you much more access as a scholar. So that's the best preparation that you can have for becoming a scholar. And by having those language skills, reading deeply and widely primary sources, I think is absolutely essential. So yes, you have to read the scholarship, and that's important. But I think knowing the primary sources and having the languages that enable you to access those primary sources, so that's the foundation on which everything else rests.
So my name is Cristian Gaspar. I am a lecturer at the Department of Medieval Studies, and I've also been a student here at the CEU, where I did my MA in 97-98, and then my PhD, and I've been working for the department since 2007.
All right, and since we are dealing with the Conference on Church Councils, could you tell us how did the church councils affect the culture and society of the period of late antiquity, or any period in which the church council was held?
One first obvious way in which they had an impact on the society around them was by the momentous decisions about the faith that they elaborated and about ecclesiastical discipline, which in spite of all appearances were not just about the faith and about ecclesiastic discipline, but reshaped in many ways the power relations within society. When a church council decides what the officially support doctrine on the incarnation, on the relationship between the divine and the human part in Jesus, should be the only acceptable definition, the only acceptable relation. This has a wider impact beyond simply the understanding of the theologians who took part in the debate, because it will be used, the definition will be used to identify, define, and ostracize all those individuals or social groups within that society that can be regarded as enemies, as legitimate targets for persecution, and even physical elimination, insofar as they refuse or are perceived to actively refuse to accept the definition on how humans should understand the divine in that society.
Now to turn to the topic of your presentation at the conference, which brought a lot of attention, could you tell us how can linguistic approach enhance our understanding of church councils?
Well, this is something that I try to convince the other participants in the conference of, and I had the great pleasure of hearing Richard Price at the end of the presentation telling me, well, I had never thought about this, but this is one very valid way in which you can approach these things. I started from the assumption that taking part in church council, which was a very unusual and extraordinary type of linguistic interaction due to the fact that it was very much staged, that it occurred in environments that were tightly controlled, where representatives of the state and of the ecclesiastical hierarchy defined relations of power between people speaking to each other. So considering this from the point of view of linguistics, and specifically sociolinguistics, which looks at the way in which language is employed in communication by various groups within a society, by various groups of speakers, can tell us something not just about the way they spoke Greek at the time, but especially about the way they chose to speak Greek at the time in this very specific context, and how that can reveal something about the identity of those speakers, whether identities defined by others or identities the speakers themselves assumed for the purpose and identified with, and about the relationship of power that is established through communication, through selection of a specific way of speaking in that circumstance, and further about how that might serve as a key for us to understand the relationships of power that obtain in that society beyond that particular event where communication was going on.
As a linguistic layman, if I may add a sub-question, Richard Price mentioned that one of the subjects which is yet to be open and that someone younger should do is the transmission of text and the circulation of text. Could linguistics help us in understand these circulations between the councils, not only in late antiquity, but even further to Second Vatican Council?
Yes, absolutely. In my view, it not only that it can and is able to do so, but it has to do so, because it provides us with a different way of understanding these fascinating collections of documents, which are the church councils, the documents of the church councils as they have been transmitted to us. My idea was that if we look at a very specific group of speakers, specifically the bishops taking part in the council proceedings, which can be defined in terms of a social group, speaking language defined by their identity as ecclesiastics in charge of church business and practicing a specific discourse on theological matters, we can see on one hand how specific sociolect can be defined. That is to say, how do bishops speak Greek in ways that are different from non-bishops in the 4th and 5th century, and on the other hand, whether being a bishop as a linguistic identity, a Greek-speaking bishop as a linguistic identity, is something that is uniform, that is coherent, or whether we can distinguish various types of bishops based on how they speak or how they choose to speak. In other words, whether looking at their performance as speakers and the ways in which this performance clashes or is hampered by their lack of linguistic competence in a specific way of speaking as bishops, what that can tell us about their educational backgrounds, what that can tell us about their possible bilingual status, what that can tell us about the way in which they can choose to use, to make a display of their education, rhetorical or otherwise, in the way they interact with the others, in the ways in which they use language as a tool to make claims to power, to establish these claims and to exercise them over the others. This is a view on the surviving Church Council Acts that has not been very much represented in scholarship so far. Very few linguistic analyses exist of this material. When a prominent historian, Fergus Miller, published a book in 2006 called A Greek-Roman Empire, Power and Belief under Theodosius II. He advocated for the need of a linguistic analysis of the surviving acts. One of the arguments that I tried to make was that by looking at the way in which in the surviving acts different registers of Greek are represented either in the speech of the same speaker, in the documents ascribed to the same speaker, or in what purport to be verbatim transcripts of actual interactions during the debates, we can notice, if we look at them through the eyes of the linguist, if there are any attempts to forge the record by depicting somebody of whom we know was of a very humble background and would not have been able to use a very high register of Greek. So by depicting this speaker in the surviving acts as somebody who makes extremely well-articulated statements, linguistically speaking, in a very high register of Greek, this contrast between competence and actual competence and representation can act as a very good guide towards the agenda of whoever redacted the final form of these documents as they have survived to us. Very often, historians and other specialists who look at these documents take them to be accurate depictions of what took place during the church councils and especially during the debates. I would argue that if close attention is paid to the disparity between what we know about certain individuals' actual competence as speakers of high Greek or low Greek or anything in between, and what we are led to believe they performed, they actually spoke in the text as it stands now, we will notice disparities that may indicate the degree to which the documents were tampered with, were redacted in order to present a coherent narrative, or in order to focus on and emphasize rhetorically some points that were felt to be extremely important by whoever redacted the documents in their final form.
And there's another question that we've asked Richard Price, but he didn't have a definitive answer. They were participants both from the Latin West and the Greek East, and at one point I'd presume that knowing Greek wasn't standard on the West. So were there linguistical barriers between them, and could you notice that from the text that a Latin-speaking bishop doesn't really understand everything that a Greek-speaking bishop says?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the surviving documentation, in that it provides such information, and it's not about just about the interplay between Latin and Greek, so the two languages of power in the empire, but we get from the Axles of Chalcedon, for instance, we get very good information about Syriac-speaking bishops who clearly state, I have signed this after it was translated to me by such and such. So it's very clear that they could not understand the Greek version of the document when it was read out loud during the debates, but it needed to be translated into Syriac for them to be able to append their signatures in full knowledge of what they were signing. Latin has a special role in all this because it is, as I said, the language of power. It is very much felt as a language that carries social prestige. Among the attendants, there are bishops that come from provinces of the empire, like Moesia or parts of Illyricum, that were bilingual, so whose inhabitants lived in a situation of bilingualism, and they act as translators for various bishops who only spoke Greek during the debates and could only understand Greek. Again, a comprehensive study of this does not exist from a modern perspective. That is to say, one that is informed about the recent developments in how we understand bilingualism, how we deal with this, and what that can tell us about certain persons. It is very clear from my preliminary explorations that, at least in the textual form in which these records survive, Latin documents are present in translations. And it's also very probable that they would have been made available, they would have been read out loud during the debates in the translated form. What I have noticed, and this was one of the points where I really liked the feedback of the audience during the conference, was that these translations of Latin documents vary in the type of register of Greek employed by the translator. Some of them are translated in a very high register of Greek, and that indicates somebody who was very proficient with a translation of extremely elaborate materials. In some other Greek translations, I have noticed typical diagnostic features of low register Greek, which means that whoever translated those documents may not have been fully capable of seizing the intricacy of the Latin original and rendering it in a Greek that would have done justice to the sophistication of the original argument. But we still need to sort them out. That is to say, we still need to draw up inventories of which one of these translations are in high registers of Greek, which ones are in low registers of Greek, and then actually compare what documents survive and how they do. All this in the full knowledge that the form available to us may have gone through successive redactions, and what we have may not be the versions of those documents presented at the time, but something that various people at various times after the event redacted and couched in forms that were regarded as acceptable for the final version of the document.
I think that you've partially answered the third question, or the final question we have for every participant, but nota bene might not be bad to answer it as a single question. Mm-hmm. What would be your advice to young scholars and emerging scholars who are interested in the study of church councils?
I'm not sure I feel comfortable giving advice to young scholars on this. I can speak as a linguist who at some point decided to get the training of a historian and combine the two in the way in which I interact with the texts and with sources today. It is worth considering that any document that we tend to use as a source can benefit from being seen, being approached, being interpreted from as many possible directions, as possible. As a historian, I tend to look upon these documents as information sources for what was going on, how people interacted with each other. At the same time, as a linguist, I tend to notice details that might make me think twice before I accept the narrative of the text as it is presented to me. I was talking before about the discrepancy between how certain individuals are made to look like speakers, what the words that are put in their mouths, and what we actually know about their competence in terms of this. One very good example of this, which I discussed in the follow-up questions and even afterwards with some of the participants, is that, for instance, we find bishops who, when given the chance to speak on their own, so to make impromptu interventions into the debate, perform in a very low register of Greek. And it's very clear for some of them that Greek is a second language, that they don't have a very good training in it. And their statements recorded there can be analyzed by a linguist very well in terms of what these people would have actually spoken if given the chance. On the other hand, in the subscriptions to the documents that define the faith, the same bishops are given highly ritualized statements that they subscribe to, saying, I, such and such, have read this and I have found it to be conform in everything to this and that and whatnot, and I regard this as my duty to agree with, and things like that. And those are couched in a completely different register of Greek, a very high register of Greek, which makes us ask the essential question: did they actually say those words when they signed the document? Or were they helped along by somebody who would have read the words out loud for formal purpose and then simply appended their signature? And if so, would they have actually understood the statements that they signed to? Now, these are all essential questions which have not always been asked. But as a linguist, this was something that I found very, very striking, that the same individual can be presented in a single document as being fairly incompetent on one hand, but then making very elaborate statements in a very elaborate version of the language, which would suggest that the same individual is very competent as a speaker. These two clash. And if you stop looking at them just with the eyes of the historian, such and such signed this on this date, which means that they agreed with what is said in the definition, but look at them as a linguist and ask yourself, is it possible that this same individual who displays a notable incompetence as a speaker of Greek would have been able to understand or to let alone formulate this actual statement that they signed to? So asking this question as well as the first one, did this person sign this and all that, opens the text up to interpretations that the authors of the text may have tried to prevent us from engaging in, or to conceal or to discourage, by the way in which they presented the text, by the way in which they built boundaries around the text, by their redaction and the way in which they allowed the text to be transmitted to us.
My name is Paulo Pachá, and I am an assistant professor at Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I have been studying Visigoth history, or the history of the Visigoth Kingdom of Toledo, since my master's.
And in your opinion, why is it important to study church councils? And what can studying church council tell us about culture and society in late antiquity?
Okay, so on the one hand, in the panorama that we have in early medieval history or late antiquity, there are not many sources, and there are lots of church councils. So on the one hand, it's a necessity to get a wider glimpse of that society. Church councils are a very important source. On the other hand, they are also important because of the breadth of topics that are discussed within church councils. So I think, as one can see just by glimpsing the program of the conference, you can study church councils from many different perspectives, and they address not only different topics in the same moment, but they also, in a way, show how some topics are more important in some time, and then you have other topics emerging over time. So in that way, I think it's a really important source. and a really important topic.
And how did someone from Brazil get interested in these topics such as Visigothic kingdom and so on?
Yeah, so I think that can be a very long answer, but if I was going to summarize, the most important information is that Brazilian history courses at the universities, they are very model on the European universities. So ancient history and medieval history are very integral and very important parts of every curriculum in every university in Brazil. So that's for sure the starting point. And once you, at least in my case, once you get a taste for the subject, I think it's easy to want more, and then you start down that rabbit hole, and you don't know where you're going to show up. That said, there are many people doing that in Brazil, so it's not that very niche subject.
On that note, what are some of the problems and difficulties that scholars from Brazil get when approaching subjects such as this?
Well, for sure, the distance to Europe, that's a major obstacle, but for sure not one that cannot be dealt with. The other one would be resources, and I would say that this is changing quickly thanks to the internet. So for sure, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that was much more difficult because libraries in Brazil are not so equipped with the resources and mainly the books that one will find in a university library in Europe. But now, thanks to internet and the rise of the PDF, this is much more easy, and I think it will be easier in the years to come. And maybe the last obstacle would be the language. In my case, that's not so much of a problem because studying Spain, Portuguese and Spanish, they are somewhat close, so it's not that hard. But I would say that every PhD student from Brazil that wants to study or research the early Middle Ages, for sure will have to learn at least English. And of course, Latin is not a problem because that is one of the resources that we have. But then English really is necessary, at least English.
And regarding the topic of your presentation at the conference, speaking of Toledo or any other councils, where is the line between theory and practice?
Yeah, so my argument is that actually it's impossible to understand theory without practice and practice without theory. So the historiography of Visigothic Spain really likes simple binary oppositions. So central and local, strong and weak, monarchy and aristocracy, theory and practice. And I would say that's an important step to go beyond these binary oppositions and understand how they work together. So they are not the same thing, theory and practice, but they sure cannot be understood in isolation. So to understand the practice, you need the theory. To understand theory, you need the practice, and they are constantly changing each other.
And to sum up this short talk, what would be some advices that you could give not only to Brazilian but also worldwide younger scholars and emerging scholars who are interested in church councils?
I would say that we have now a very international field, like in general, in historical studies, in late antiquity, in the early medieval ages, also in council studies. And that's for sure, it's a very positive thing. At the same time, for this to be more and more valuable, I think it's also important to have new perspectives. So on the one hand, to really know the historiography and to understand what are the trends in these areas, but at the same time to think what one can add or how to go a little bit beyond or how to develop some of these lines. At the same time, there are always lots to do, lots of things to research and to explore.
I am Sabine Panzram, Chair of Ancient History at Hamburg University. I am interested in social history of power, and I'm focusing the Western Mediterranean, especially urban studies.
Thank you. Professor Panzram, tell us, how did the church councils affect culture and society of the late antique period?
This is a very good question, and it's a very complex one. It's not so easy to answer, because we know that bishops, also lay people were meeting, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula and in regional and general councils, and they were debating about 2 days, about 1 week, and the results of these councils came to us in the so-called Acta. And what we can read there are a kind of regulation, for example, concerning theological problems, but also the discipline of living. That means that they are trying to organize daily life, or the question of the clerical cursus honorum, but also sometimes political stuff, so to speak. Who is going to be the successor of whom in a bishopric? And for us nowadays, it's difficult really to realize what was practiced, what was realized after these decisions, who theoretically had the power of laws, but practically often weren't taken into consideration. That's a real problem from the historical point of view.
Thank you. And can you tell us something about the space in which it happened, and how is a conciliar town made?
That's a very good question also, because we don't know so much about it. If you are asking me about the making of a town like Toledo, a modern Toledo, ancient Toledo, I would answer that the only reason why the Visigoths have chosen this town for the councils has been the geostrategical position of the town, which was right in the middle of the Iberian Peninsula, and so easy to reach for everybody. Because we know that assisting at the councils has been quite a problem for a lot of clerics. It was not so easy to travel in these days, and so a strategical point was good. You can also have a look at Goal, where the first council was taking place in Arelate, which is also a good position at the coast right now, or right now not, but at the River Rhone, so it was easy to reach, yeah. And I think in the case of Toledo, it was just that the only reason, because Toledo in Roman times what was not an important town at all, and the Visigoths need a lot of work, so to speak, to construct Toledo as what it becomes, Civitas Regis, the main capital of the kingdom, but also the main town for councils. Concerning architecture or special buildings, institutions for the councils, our problem is that nowadays we don't have archaeological evidence. for answering this question. Almost all churches or ecclesiastical buildings concerning these centuries are not excavated or are not identified at this point. So if we are looking at the literary transmission, we just have like the meeting was held in Secretarium, yeah, or later on in the church of Petrus et Paulus. But it's difficult to imagine that if we are thinking at the Third Council of Toledo, where about 53 bishops were presented with clerics, with other clerics also, so we have to imagine about 1,100 persons, and at 633, the Fourth Council, we have about 83 bishops, yeah, so even more people. So it's difficult to imagine how they really have met, yeah, because you need a hall, you need a big room. But unfortunately, we don't have an idea where they really met. So what I can say, surely you would have need this sites for the meeting. And you also would have need, from a logistical point of view, the possibility that all these bishops could spend a night a week in Toledo. But right now we don't know where they really did it.
And then, if I may pose a methodological question, as you mentioned, there is no archaeological evidence, there is some insinuation of the space from the sources. But can we still study spatial analysis, spatial study, or art history, or rather architectural history without archaeological sources?
I mean, there are various projects in the search of Toledo, because Toledo still nowadays is the most important bishopric of Spain. And there was created since 589 a kind of myth concerning that conversion to Catholicism. So every little piece, every architectural fragment that has been found in Toledo or around Toledo has been interpreted as forming part of, yeah. And, for example, the modern Museo de los Concilios, which has been the church of Santa Leocadia, is considered to be one of the churches where the council had taken place. But I would say that this information has to be verified. Yeah, so I wouldn't say there is no archaeological evidence. There is some, but open to various interpretations. And also the recent excavations in the suburbium of Toledo, la so-called Vega Baja, has been one of the most debated excavations of the Visigothic time in Spain since about 15 or 20 years right now. Yeah, so looking for the remains of Visigothic Spain and the councils, the early general councils, is also today a political question, not just a historical one or a cultural one, but I would say, first of all, a political one.
Regarding this, how did the idea of having a council in Toledo influence later importance of the city? For example, when you go there, every touristic guide will speak about Jews and many other aspects and importance of Toledo, but I've never heard from a touristic guide about the council.
You never heard anything?
No, from a touristic guide.
No, that's really interesting, because I must admit, I suppose that they mentioned it, because the third one of 589, which is that one where the conversion to Catholicism took place, is so important, and it's like, I would say it's like a lieu de mémoire, one of these very famous events in the cultural memory of the Spanish nation also today, that they should mention it. I think people are aware of that, at least people living there right now. And if you have a look at Spanish school books, it's one of these very famous lectures everyone is learning in school, that Toledo was the city of the most important councils taking place in the 6th and 7th century. Yeah, so it's really part of the Christianized memory of Spain. Yeah.
While I'm certain there are still many interesting topics we could open with Toledo, I'd like to ask you a final question, and that is regarding this conference, and maybe how do you see the future of church council studies, and what would be your advice to emerging and young scholars?
An advice is always difficult to give, but an advice would be interdisciplinarity. I think this is very important because normally early church history is made by theological trained students or colleagues. And what I really found interesting is myself, for example, as an ancient historian, my approach is that one of social history, which is not so much interested in the theological aspects, but really in the question how the council is embedded in social history of the time, how we can contextualize what they are discussing about, and what you mentioned first of all, how we can get an idea of the impact the decisions of the bishops really have in society. So if you are interested in that, you really have, which is one of the great merits of Richard Price, also presented translations nowadays, so you can work with that really fascinating source, and you should do it from a lot of possible perspectives, yeah? From the archaeological one, that one of social history, theology, philosophy, maybe. But that would be really an interesting and fascinating project to do this.
Oh, yes, I'm full professor of early medieval studies at the University of Zurich.
Okay, thank you, Professor Scholz. And tell us, why do you think that it is important to study church councils, and how do church councils affect late antique and early medieval culture and society?
Yes, it's an important question. I think it's very, very important to see the structure of rights in these regions, especially in the Frankish kingdom. We have legal pluralism, and the church councils in one part of this legal pluralism. And you can see at different fields that the ecclesiastical law have an influence at the legal, at the secular law, and as an yes, I will give some examples. There is a question of freedmen and who were they integrated in the society, and the church will have protected them that they know will become slaves, because the Theodosian Code have a regular term that if a freedman is not grateful to his patron, he can be will be a slave. Mm-hmm. And or the cause of abandoned children, the church have changed the secular law to a better protection of abandoned children. And this is, I think, it's important for the society as a whole.
And tell us, how important was the question of property and issues dealing with property on the church councils?
Yes, I think it's a very, very important question, because not only in the Merovingian period, but in the Frankish period under the Carolingians and so on, church property is having great importance for the kings. And the kings take this property of the churches and give it to its followers. And so the church have a problem. and the church needed this property for the poor, for the needies of the priests and the buildings of the churches and so on. And you can see the problems when you look to Rome. At Rome, you have every day at St. Peter and at the Lateran, 100 poor people who get substantial things to live from the church. And if the church lost his property, there is no the property is diminished, and there is no material to give them the needy things for life.
I think it's very clear that studying church councils is also a question of social history. And in this regard, what would be your advices to young and emerging scholars who are interested in this field?
Oh, yes. I think it's very useful to have a close look at the texts, and not at the translations, but at the Latin or Greek text. And at one hand and the other hand, you have to realize that the transmission of the texts is a very important part in the regarding history, and you have to look, is the manuscript from this time of the councils, 6th century or so on, or it's 300 years later, and you will find some changing sentences and novelties in the text, if you can control it. If you have only manuscripts from the 9th century, you cannot control it. But we have the fact that we in some cases we can control it, and I think it's rather important to do so.